April 1963, Camp Freiburg, Germany. We were assigned to Camp Freiburg a year before the mission, nothing out of the ordinary for a team like ours. Phantom Legion, the name. We were part of a special ops unit that handled covert rescues, high-risk infiltrations, and all those missions that weren't exactly in the public eye. They didn't want to talk about us in the briefing rooms, but everyone knew the score. We were the ones who went into places that the rest of the military couldn't afford to touch. The Huey helicopter we were assigned for the mission wasn't anything special, but it got the job done. It was an older model, the kind that's been patched up many times. The metal skin had seen its share of combat and wear, and it smelled of engine grease and gunpowder. The windows were small, offering limited views of the landscape below, but we'd all grown used to it by now. Its rotor blades were loud, deafening even, but it was dependable, exactly what we needed for a covert operation like this. The helicopter was a standard issue from the 7th Army in Germany, a US Army unit stationed in the country during the tense years of the Cold War. This base, Camp Freiburg, was a key site in a strategic region that bordered both East and West Germany. We'd been stationed there as part of NATO's ongoing efforts to deter Soviet aggression. The constant presence of the Berlin Wall and the looming threat of conflict meant we were always on alert, always ready. Camp Freiburg wasn't a big base, but it was packed with history. The barracks were cramped, and the halls always smelled like burnt coffee and iron. The camp had been around since the end of World War II, and though it had been modernized in some ways, it still had that gritty, utilitarian feel. It was the kind of place where morale stayed high, mainly through camaraderie, a shared understanding that we were all part of something bigger. But the air was always heavy with the pressure of potential conflict, especially in the 60s. The Cold War made everything tense. There were rumors of Soviet agents, whispers of espionage, and constant drills in case war broke out. The Cold War had put us in a weird spot. The world was on the edge, with the Iron Curtain dividing Europe like a massive wound in the earth. NATO needed men like us to stay sharp, to be prepared for anything that could happen if the Soviets decided to escalate. Every day we trained, we fought mock battles, we ran recon missions, learning how to blend in with the environment, how to move quietly, how to think faster than the enemy. And so, when the call came to deploy on this mission, it was no surprise. It didn't matter that we were here in Germany on a peacekeeping assignment. The Cold War wasn't just about keeping watch over the Soviets. It was about keeping the peace on every front, even if that meant finding lost civilians in a haunted forest. I remember the morning we left the base. It was still early, the sun barely up, casting a cold, gray light over the camp. The helicopter was waiting for us on the tarmac, its rotor blades slicing through the morning mist. The ground crew had already prepped it, checked the fuel, made sure everything was secure. It wasn't the newest model, but it had seen us through dozens of missions. As we climbed aboard, the hum of the rotor blades filled the space around us, rattling the metal frame of the chopper. The air smelled like exhaust and sweat, a mixture that was strangely familiar. "We're gonna get this done, huh, Eagle-Eye?" Tommy's voice cut through the noise as he slung his gear over his shoulder, looking up at me with a grin. "Yeah, just another day in paradise," I muttered, settling into my seat. "We'll be back in time. This'll be easy." Of course, that was just me trying to calm my nerves. We didn't know how this was going to go. There were too many unknowns, and that was the part that always got to you. We trained for 100 different scenarios, but this mission? It was different. The locals had been talking about things we didn't want to believe. Some stories were just too strange to even consider. Still, we were soldiers. We did our job. The ride from Camp Freiburg to the Black Forest, Schwarzwald, was about an hour. It wasn't a long journey, but that hour felt like a lifetime. We were flying low to avoid detection, part of the mission's secrecy. The helicopter's engine roared. We weren't exactly going stealth mode, but we weren't making any friends either. "Tell me again why we're not just taking a truck?" Ben's voice came over the intercom, his tone dry. "We're not exactly making this quiet, you know. Because trucks don't fly, Grizzly," Jackal answered, smirking. "And they sure as hell can't get us into a place like the Black Forest without getting stuck in the mud." "Yeah, right. And helicopters don't get us stuck in trees, do they?" Ben replied, his voice sarcastic but laced with humor. "Quit complaining, you'll be fine," Sarah's voice cut in. She was always the one to calm the mood, even if it was with an eye roll over the comms. "We're almost there, anyway. Just sit tight." I could hear her tapping something on her tablet in the front of the chopper, probably double-checking the maps and coordinates. Sarah was always focused when it came to our route, especially with comms. She could read a map like it was her own handwriting. As we neared the forest, the weather began to shift. The gray morning light faded, replaced by the thick, creeping mist that rolled out from between the trees like something alive. The Black Forest had always had this reputation for being eerily quiet. The deeper you went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. Like the woods were holding their breath, waiting. The tension in the chopper grew as the landscape below shifted from cultivated fields to dense, dark woods. The trees seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, their shadows long and deep. From up here, it looked serene, almost peaceful, until you thought about the stories. I glanced over at Gunnar. He was staring out the window, his jaw set tight. I could tell he was deep in thought. Gunnar had been around long enough to know that, sometimes, it wasn't the mission that killed you, it was the unknown. "You're sure you want to do this?" I asked him, keeping my voice low. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, as if he was trying to convince himself more than me. "Someone's got to get them out of there," he said. "And that someone's us." I could feel the weight of his words. Gunnar didn't say much, but when he did, it was always to remind us why we were here. To remind us of the stakes. As we approached the landing zone, I could see the trees ahead getting darker. The mist had thickened, and it looked like the forest was swallowing the chopper whole. "All right, here we go," I said, tightening my grip on my seat. "Let's stick to the plan, stay sharp, and get those civilians out." We all nodded, bracing for what was to come. The helicopter blades whirred for a few more seconds before falling silent, leaving us in a heavy stillness. The damp, cold air bit at our skin as we disembarked and began to stretch our legs after the cramped flight. Our boots crunched in the thick layer of pine needles and damp earth as we stood in the shadow of the looming Black Forest. There was an unnatural stillness to the place. No sounds of birds, no rustling of wildlife. It felt like the whole forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. "All right, let's get to work," I said, pulling out the map the commander had given us. We gathered around, a circle of soldiers in front of the helicopter, the distant rumble of the rotor blades still ringing in our ears. Sarah took the map from me and spread it out on the ground, smoothing the creases as best as she could. "Here," she said, pointing at the faded ink markings. "We're right here on the edge." The tourists were last seen further in, about 5 clicks from where we're standing. We all leaned in, scrutinizing the map. The layout of the Black Forest was like a maze, dense, sprawling, and nearly impossible to navigate without a guide. The paths were faintly marked, but the terrain was too thick for any vehicle to pass through. Only foot travel was an option. "This is a lot thicker than I thought," Jackal muttered, eyeing the darkened trees. "You could get lost in here for days." "Could be why they haven't been found yet," Ben added, his tone heavy with concern. "The area around these coordinates looks wild." I nodded, squatting down next to the map. The thicker parts of the forest were marked with bold, jagged lines, symbolizing the treacherous terrain. "We'll have to move quick," I said. "We can't waste time trying to figure out which path to take. We'll stick to the main trails, stay low, stay fast. We'll split into 2 teams. One team moves north along the trail, while the other heads east. We'll cover more ground that way." Everyone nodded in agreement, but I could tell from their faces that the tension was starting to seep in. This forest wasn't just an obstacle, it felt wrong. "Got that right," Gunnar replied in a low voice. "I don't trust this place. The sooner we're done, the better." With our plan in place, we gathered our gear, rifles, radios, medical packs, and the explosives Ben had brought along just in case. The weight of the equipment felt like a heavy burden, but we knew what we had to do. Rescue the civilians and get out of here. Simple. The light grew dimmer with every step we took deeper into the woods. The trees seemed to press in on all sides, casting long shadows over the narrow path that snaked through the underbrush. Tommy was in the lead, his rifle held tight in his hands, eyes scanning the trees. Jackal followed close behind, his face set, and Ben brought up the rear, his heavy steps thudding with every movement. The rest of us fanned out, keeping our heads low, trying to move without making a sound. The silence was eerie. Every so often, a gust of wind would stir the leaves above, sending a soft rustle through the branches. But even then, the forest felt off. There were no animals. No birds, no small critters, nothing. The deeper we went, the more unnerving it became. "I don't like this," Mikey muttered from behind me. Not a sound. It's like the whole damn forest is waiting for us. "I'm right there with you," I said, glancing over my shoulder at him. "Stay sharp." The path we were following began to widen, and the trees thinned a little, but the sense of being watched lingered. The deeper we went, the more the sense of dread crept in. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. An hour passed, and the air grew heavier, thicker. The scent of damp earth filled our lungs as we pressed forward, hoping to find some sign of the lost tourists. But the further we ventured into the woods, the more I realized something unsettling. It wasn't just the eerie quiet. It was the way the trees seemed to move, like they were shifting in response to our presence. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but then I saw it again. The trees seemed to bend inward, their limbs reaching toward us as we passed. "Did anyone else see that?" Mikey whispered. "What?" Tommy asked, his voice barely audible. "The trees," Mikey said, his voice tight. "They're moving." I glanced back. For a split second, I swore I saw the branches of the trees swaying in a way that wasn't natural, even though there was no wind. It was as if the forest was alive. I shook my head. "It's just the wind. Don't start getting spooked." But even as I said it, I couldn't convince myself. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and that sense of being watched only grew stronger. The forest had a presence, a weight to it, like it was aware of us. Another hour passed, and we hadn't found anything. No sign of the tourists, no sign of any movement. Just the quiet, oppressive atmosphere of the woods. That's when we heard it, the first sound. It wasn't anything we'd expected. No animals, no distant voices, just a soft creaking, like wood bending under pressure. And then a slow, haunting sound, a whisper. It was faint at first, like someone calling from far away. But the whisper grew louder, more distinct. "Did you hear that?" Jackal asked, his voice tight with unease. "It's just the wind," I said, but there was a tremor in my voice now. "Stay focused." We pushed forward again, but the air seemed to thicken with every step, like the forest was closing in on us. The whispering continued, now mingling with soft rustling sounds, as if someone, was moving just out of sight, following us. Suddenly, a voice broke through the growing tension. "Gunner, you hear it now, don't you?" he said, his voice low, almost a growl. "The forest, it's alive at night. It doesn't like intruders." "Gunner, don't start with that crap," Ben snapped, but even his voice lacked the usual confidence. Gunner's face was grim. "It's not just superstition. The locals around here, they know. They stay away from these woods at night. This place is something else." We kept moving, though now every crack of a branch, every rustle in the leaves felt like it could be the end of us. As we made our way deeper into the woods, the unsettling reality of our mission began to weigh on us more heavily. We were here to rescue a group of people, an elite family from the US who had gone missing. But the more we thought about them, the more questions piled up. The whole situation didn't sit right. I glanced at Ben, who had been unusually quiet. He was one of the more experienced men on the team, and he usually kept his thoughts to himself, but this time, I could see the wheels turning in his mind. "You know," Ben started, breaking the silence, "this whole thing feels off. We're not just talking about some random tourists here. These people, this family, they're important." "I know," I said, pulling my jacket tighter around me as we trudged through the thick underbrush. "The Martins. I've read the intel. Their influence runs deep. The Martins were a family with connections that reached all the way to the top. Wealthy, well-connected in Washington, and involved in several major corporations and government projects. They were the kind of family that could make or break political careers, with ties to some of the most powerful people in the US government. Their disappearance wasn't just a tragedy, it had the potential to be a diplomatic nightmare. Powerful family, Mikey added. I heard their son, Jason, was in line to inherit a major defense contract from the Pentagon. That contract could have meant millions, maybe billions. I nodded, frowning. Exactly. And that's why we're here. Their disappearance? It's not just a simple search and rescue anymore. It's a political time bomb. The more I thought about it, the more the whole thing made sense in a dark, twisted way. The Cold War was in full swing. The US and the Soviets were neck and neck, each side trying to outmaneuver the other on every front, from nuclear weapons to political influence in Europe. And if the Soviets were involved in any way, this wouldn't be the first time they'd attempted something as bold as kidnapping a high-profile target. It wouldn't surprise me if the Soviets got their hands on them, Ben muttered, voicing the thought that had been running through my mind. I'm with you there, I said. I've been briefed on the possibility of abduction. The timing couldn't be worse. The Cold War's heating up, and these people could be a bargaining chip, especially with their ties to US defense contracts. Hell, they could have been lured here intentionally, Mikey added, his voice tight. The Martins are influential. If they've got a lead on something the Soviets want, then taking them off the map would be a way to get the upper hand. That's what I think happened, I said. Maybe the tourists weren't just lost. Maybe it's a cover-up. We don't know what kind of information they had or who they were meeting with when they disappeared. But they've got connections in places we can't even imagine. That's why this is so damn critical. We all fell quiet, each of us considering the possibility that this wasn't a random disappearance. If the Soviets had gotten involved, if they had come into the Black Forest for a high-stakes operation, it would explain why the mission was kept under wraps. If a powerful family was missing and suspected to have been taken by a foreign enemy, it could shake the foundations of US politics. No one could know the truth, especially not the public. Do you think the Soviets are still in the area? Jackal asked, his voice low. I mean, are they lurking around here watching us? Maybe, I said. We've seen signs that we're being watched, haven't we? The strange symbols, the animal carcasses. Maybe it's not just the forest that's alive. Maybe we're in the middle of something bigger than we thought. The idea that we could be walking into a Cold War operation, hidden beneath the veil of superstition and folklore, was unsettling. If the Soviets were involved, they wouldn't hesitate to make the situation worse. They'd use any means necessary to keep their involvement a secret. And then there's the witch, Tommy chimed in, his voice dripping with sarcasm, though his unease was clear. Yeah, let's not forget the witch. As if the Soviets weren't enough to worry about. I glanced at him, a little annoyed, but I understood his point. The thought of a witch was absurd, especially in the context of an international kidnapping. But the strange happenings in the forest, combined with the eerie symbols and the rotting animals, made it hard to ignore the possibility that something more sinister was at work. We had been sent here to find the Martins, but the deeper we dug, the more it seemed like the entire situation was layered with false leads, supernatural mysteries, and dark political intrigue. We weren't just hunting for lost tourists, we were potentially walking into an international crisis. If the Soviets had orchestrated this, we might have just triggered a much larger conflict than we'd bargained for. But we couldn't back out now. The Martins were missing, and it was our job to find them, no matter the cost. We stick to the plan, I said finally, my voice firm. We find them, we get them out, and we get the hell out of here before nightfall. Whatever's going on, we don't have the luxury of second-guessing. We'll be fine, Jackal said with a forced grin, but I could see the tension in his eyes. We just have to make it out before the witch or the Soviets, or whoever the hell else is out here, decides to make us part of their problem. I shook my head. No one's making us part of their problem. We're going to bring the Martins back. As we pushed forward, the eerie feeling continued to grow. I couldn't shake the thought that we were being drawn into something far darker than we were prepared for. The Martins weren't just some wealthy tourists who had wandered off the path. There was more to their disappearance. There was something bigger at play, something that might involve not just politics, but forces that we didn't even understand. And whatever that something was, it was only a matter of time before we found out. It was around 7:30 p.m. when we set up camp, the last light of the day barely filtering through the thick canopy above. The shadows in the black forest stretched longer, darker with every passing minute, and the smell, the stench, hung thick in the air, as if the land itself was rotting. The temperature had dropped sharply, and our breath clouded in front of us as we huddled around the small fire we'd managed to get going. The flames flickered weakly against the dark that seemed to swallow us whole. We were all tired, but the weight of the mission kept us on edge. The Martins, wealthy, politically connected American elites, had gone missing here in the vast, treacherous expanse of the German Black Forest. Their disappearance wasn't just a matter of lost tourists. Their political ties to the Pentagon, their defense contracts, all of it had made their vanishing a significant diplomatic issue. Everyone in our command knew that if we failed to find them, the repercussions would go far beyond military protocol. This wasn't just about saving lives. It was about preserving U.S. influence at the height of the Cold War. Despite the gravity of the situation, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The trees seemed to close in on us with every step, the dense undergrowth blocking our view of anything beyond the immediate camp area. The Black Forest, or Schwarzwald, in Germany was infamous for its eerie stillness and long history of folklore. In medieval times, it was said to be the home of witches and spirits, with tales of cursed lands and cursed souls that had been passed down through generations. I had tried to push those thoughts out of my head, but with each minute that passed, they grew harder to ignore. "We should get some rest," I said, trying to push away the unease in my gut. But it wasn't going to happen. No one was truly at ease in this place. We ate what little rations we had, half-heartedly discussing our plan for the next day. I could tell we were all running on fumes, too tired to even joke. Even Mikey, the most upbeat guy on the team, was silent. As the night crept closer, the sounds of the forest grew louder. The wind through the trees became a low hum, and every creak of a branch or snap of a twig had us looking over our shoulders. Then, just as the last of the daylight was snuffed out and we were left with only the flickering firelight and the inky blackness of the woods, we saw them. Two figures emerged from the dark edge of the clearing, slowly, deliberately. It was impossible to tell where they had come from. The trees were too thick, the night too dense. They moved like shadows, like they were part of the forest itself. An old man, tall and thin, with a face that looked as though it had been weathered by time itself, appeared first. He was dressed in worn, faded clothes, nothing that would stand out in the wilderness of the Black Forest. His wife, hunched and frail, was close behind him, her face gaunt, eyes wide with fear and something else. The glow from our fire caught their faces, and I swear, for a moment, they seemed more like specters than people. The man didn't speak immediately. He just stood there, staring at us with an unsettling intensity, his eyes flicking from one team member to the next. It was like he was searching for something, some sign that we were a threat. When he finally spoke, it wasn't in German, but in an old, local dialect. A dialect that was only understood by the few still living in these parts. His words were sharp, rushed, and it was clear he was trying to convey something urgent. "Leave. Leave now. She is near. The witch. She is near." I wasn't sure what to make of it at first. We were all still reeling from the exhaustion of the journey, the weight of the mission. But his words made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Ben was the first to step forward, his hand instinctively resting on the grip of his rifle. "What's going on here, old man? Who are you?" The old man didn't seem to notice Ben's challenge. Instead, his eyes locked on mine, his face almost pleading. "She is near. You do not understand. The witch has taken my daughter. She feeds on the blood of the innocent. She preys on fear. On your fear." At this, the woman, who had been standing quietly beside him, muttered something low under her breath. The air grew colder, the wind picking up, and there was a faint rustling from the trees that sent a shiver down my spine. I glanced at my team. Tommy, Mikey, and Jackal all exchanged uneasy glances. We weren't a superstitious group, but the strange intensity of this encounter was enough to make anyone question their assumptions. The witch? Mikey scoffed. Are you serious? This isn't a fairy tale. We don't have time for this kind of talk. We're here to find the Martins, not. The old man raised a shaking hand and pointed toward the depths of the forest, beyond the firelight. His voice dropped to a whisper, but the words were still sharp with fear. She took my daughter, many others. She lures you with promises, with sweetness, but she feasts on fear. Her hunger is endless. Do not trust the shadows here. I could feel the tension mounting. His warning, however irrational it might have seemed, had struck a chord deep inside me. And I wasn't the only one who felt it. I could see Ben's face harden, but his eyes flicked toward the surrounding darkness, his fingers tightening on his rifle. You will be next, the woman rasped, her voice barely audible. The witch is always near. She waits for those who fear her, and when she calls, you cannot resist. But we were soldiers. We had a job to do. I didn't have time to entertain ghost stories. So, despite the foreboding nature of their words, we shook it off. We're not going anywhere, Ben said firmly. We've got a mission. We'll deal with whatever this is later. The Martins are our priority. I saw the doubt in Mikey's eyes, but he didn't speak. Instead, we all remained silent, as if the air itself was pressing us to reconsider. But the mission came first. The old man, still standing at the edge of our camp, watched us with a sadness in his eyes. For a long moment, no one moved. It felt as if the forest itself had come alive, its ancient trees and thick darkness pressing in on us. Then, without another word, the old couple turned and began to walk away, their figures swallowed by the night as quickly as they had appeared. As their silhouettes disappeared into the trees, I felt a shiver run down my spine, a gnawing sensation that something was very, very wrong. You hear that? Jackal asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Yeah, I said. I hear it. The wind howled through the trees, and the forest seemed to close in around us. But we had a job to do. No matter how dark or twisted this place seemed, we had to find the Martins. As we settled down for the night, none of us could shake the feeling that the old man's words were far from a mere superstition. There was something in the air now, something deeper, more primal. The forest wasn't just alive with the sounds of nature, it felt alive with something else. It was around 1 a.m. when we began to rotate watch. The fire had burned low, leaving only a faint glow that barely lit the clearing. The air was colder now, the dampness from the forest floor creeping up into my bones, but we all knew the drill. Some of us needed rest, and others had to keep watch. We couldn't afford to sleep too deeply in a place like this, not with the strange happenings all around us. The forest felt alive, and there was a heavy weight to the stillness. I lay down, but my thoughts were too loud for sleep. I heard the occasional rustling of branches, the sound of something moving in the distance. No one had mentioned it yet, but the weight of the night, of what the old man and his wife had said, hung over us. The fear was palpable in the silence. Ben, always the more laid-back member of the team, took his turn first. He slouched by the fire, keeping an eye on the shadows around us. His silhouette was faint against the backdrop of the dark forest, and for a moment, I could see his face, tired but determined, his eyes scanning the tree line. The forest was eerily still, too still. A heavy, unnatural silence pressed against the air, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig or the rustling of leaves. It was in these moments that the mind starts to play tricks on you, and as Ben stared into the dark, he saw something that made his breath catch in his throat. It was a faint glow, soft, almost otherworldly, coming from deeper in the woods. At first, he thought it was just his eyes playing tricks, but the glow persisted, flickering like a distant light. Without thinking, he stood, his curiosity pulling him toward the source. His boots barely made a sound on the forest floor as he moved. The air grew colder the closer he got to the glow, and with each step, his heart started to race. It wasn't just the cold that made him shiver, there was something else in the air, something magnetic, pulling him forward. When he finally reached the source of the glow, he froze. Standing before him, almost as if she had materialized from the shadows themselves, was a girl. She was young, no more than 16 or 17, and incredibly beautiful. Her pale skin seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight, and her long hair cascaded down her back, dark and untamed. Her eyes, wide and filled with something like curiosity, locked onto his immediately. The forest behind her seemed to fade into a blur, as if she were the only thing that mattered in that moment. Her body was barely covered. She was wearing nothing more than tattered rags that barely clung to her form. And yet, there was something alluring about her, an aura that was both innocent and seductive in a way that Ben could hardly understand. For a moment he stood there, frozen. The beauty of her was like a pull, a weight in his chest that made everything else seem far away. He had been in dangerous situations before, but this was something else entirely. She smiled at him, her lips curling into a soft, inviting grin. "Who are you?" Ben finally managed to ask, his voice barely a whisper. The girl's smile grew wider. "I've been waiting for you," she said, her voice soft, melodic, almost like a song. "Come closer. I won't bite. I'm not like the others." Ben's breath hitched in his throat. He had heard rumors, whispers of strange, alluring women that lived deep in the forest, creatures of the night who used their beauty to trap unwary travelers. But none of that seemed to matter now. All that mattered was her, and the magnetic pull she had over him. "You've been waiting for me?" Ben asked, almost laughing at how ridiculous the situation felt. But he couldn't help himself. He took a step closer. "Yes," the girl said, her voice almost a whisper now. "I live here. You can stay with me. Come home with me." Her words seemed to echo in his mind, repeating like a song stuck on a loop. The firelight danced in her eyes, and Ben found himself drawn to her even more. He felt his heart race, his mind clouding with desire. He wasn't thinking clearly. Every logical thought that might have stopped him was pushed away by the overwhelming pull of her presence. Ben stammered, "I don't know. It's dangerous out here. I have to go back." As Ben stood there in the dim glow of the moonlight, staring at the beautiful girl, a strange pull surged through him, stronger than any rational thought. Her presence was hypnotic, almost unreal. The warmth from the fire now felt distant, as if it belonged to another world entirely. But Ben wasn't a fool. Despite the dizziness, something deep inside him tugged at his thoughts. He took a deep breath and tried to push the haze from his mind. His voice, barely above a whisper, broke the silence. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said, his words slower than usual, like he was fighting to stay focused. "This place is dangerous. I don't know how you got here, but you need to go back. It's not safe." The girl smiled, and there was a haunting sweetness in the way she looked at him. She took a slow step toward him, the faint glow around her intensifying with every movement. Her eyes, dark and captivating, locked onto his. She tilted her head as if contemplating his words, her smile never fading. "But I'm not alone," she said softly, her voice like a velvet caress. "I'm here with you now." Ben shook his head, trying to break free from the pull of her words. He had to make sense of this. This wasn't right. The air around them felt too still, too thick with the unknown. "No, you're not understanding. Where are your family? You can't just wander the forest like this. You don't belong out here." The girl's smile faltered for a brief moment, a flicker of something, sadness, maybe, passing over her features. But it was gone before he could even register it. She stepped closer, so close now that Ben could feel her breath against his skin. His pulse quickened, and he struggled to remain clear-headed. "My family," she echoed his words, though there was no real understanding in her tone. "I'm here because I belong here. This is where I'm meant to be." Ben's stomach churned, the pull of her beauty and the strange gravity she seemed to exert over him pushing him further from reality. But the voice of reason, faint as it was, remained in the back of his mind, telling him something was terribly wrong. He took another step back, still trying to focus on her. "You don't belong out here alone. There's something in the woods. There's something wrong with this place." The girl's eyes flickered in the direction of the dark forest behind her, her expression unreadable now. She didn't seem alarmed, just unnaturally calm. "You're wrong," she said softly, the smile returning, but there was an edge to it now. "I'm not alone. I'm exactly where I need to be." Her words sent a cold shiver through Ben's spine. He couldn't explain it, but there was something terrifying in the way she said it, something ancient in her voice. Before he could say anything more, he heard the crunch of boots on the forest floor. A voice pierced the thick silence. "Ben." It was Sergeant Weber. She was suddenly there, emerging from the shadows. The girl, the glowing figure, was gone in the blink of an eye, disappearing back into the woods, like she had never been there at all. Ben's heart pounded in his chest. His mind raced. What the hell had just happened? He turned to Weber, his face pale, his eyes wide, trying to explain what he had seen. She was here. Ben's voice was frantic. She was real. Weber looked at him with narrowed eyes, her expression hardening. She scanned the dark forest around them, then back at Ben. Who was here? Ben looked back toward where the girl had stood, but all that remained was the oppressive darkness of the black forest. He opened his mouth to speak again, but the words caught in his throat. "There was a girl," he said weakly. She was glowing and she was real. She said she was waiting for me to come." Ben's voice trailed off, the shock evident on his face. His breath came in ragged gasps and he was trembling slightly. Sergeant Weber stared at him for a long moment, her brow furrowed. She could tell he wasn't making this up, there was no deception in his eyes. But the whole situation was off. Too strange. Too unreal. "We need to get back to camp," Weber said firmly, her tone brokering no argument. She turned and started walking, motioning for Ben to follow. As they made their way back to camp, the others were already stirring. The firelight flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the clearing. Ben's eyes were wide, his movements stiff, and it wasn't long before the others noticed. "You okay, man?" Mikey asked, glancing up from his gear. His eyes were bleary with exhaustion, but there was concern in his voice. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Ben didn't answer right away. He just sat down heavily by the fire, his hands trembling. His face was pale, almost ashen. Something in his eyes, a look of pure confusion and fear, made the others fall silent. "What happened, Ben?" Jackal asked, his voice low, almost too casual. But it was clear he could see something was wrong. "Tell us," Mikey pressed, his tone more insistent now. "What the hell happened out there?" Ben swallowed hard, trying to find the words. I don't know. There was a girl. She was glowing and she was right there, just standing in front of me. She said she was waiting for me. I tried to tell her it was dangerous, that she shouldn't be out there alone, but then she disappeared. Just like that. I don't know." A strange silence followed, the only sounds being the crackling of the fire and the occasional creak of the trees. The rest of the team exchanged uneasy glances. It was clear they were all processing what Ben had just said. "You've been hitting the whiskey a little hard, haven't you, Ben?" Mikey said with a forced chuckle, though it was clear he was trying to ease the tension. "You sure you didn't just see things?" Ben's eyes flashed with irritation, and he shook his head vehemently. "No, it wasn't like that. I'm telling you, she was real. She was here." But Mikey wasn't convinced. Neither was Tommy, who gave Ben a skeptical look. "You sure it wasn't just the exhaustion getting to you? I mean, we've been on the move for hours now. Stress, sleep deprivation. It messes with your head." Weber, who had returned to camp, overheard the exchange and stepped in. "We're all under a lot of pressure right now. Ben isn't imagining things, but we need to stay focused on the mission. We can't let whatever's happening out there distract us from the task at hand." But Ben wasn't sure anymore. The part of him, deep down, was terrified. Had he really seen the girl? Or was this place starting to mess with his mind? Was it the fatigue, the isolation, or was it something more sinister in the woods? The rest of the team, still unsure, seemed to move on, but the tension remained. We all went about the usual preparations for the night, but beneath it all, there was a gnawing unease. Ben wasn't the only one feeling it now. And as the fire flickered and the night pressed in around us, I couldn't help but wonder, what was out there in those woods? And how long could we last before the forest, whatever it was, swallowed us whole? The morning came, but it brought no relief. The faint light of dawn barely pierced through the thick canopy of trees above, casting long, eerie shadows on the forest floor. The damp air hung heavily around us, and a sense of unease settled in like a weight on our chests. We had all barely slept, but we needed to push forward. Ben's strange behavior had everyone on edge, and now he was missing. We woke to find the camp silent, save for the crackling of the dying embers in the fire. I looked around. Ben wasn't there. Ben! I called out, my voice rough from lack of sleep. No answer. We all got to our feet quickly, scanning the area around the camp, the dense trees blocking out the early morning light. It didn't make sense. He couldn't have gone far, could he? The forest was vast, but he wasn't the type to wander off without telling anyone, especially not after everything that had happened the night before. The confusion was still fresh in my mind, but this was different. Where the hell is he? Mikey muttered under his breath, looking around, his eyes filled with anxiety. He was here last night. We all saw him, right? I nodded, though there was no confidence behind the gesture. He was here, Mikey, but something's off. We need to find him now. We split up, heading in different directions. The air was thick with a strange, sour scent that clung to our clothes, stinging our nostrils. The forest felt alive, but not in any natural way. The trees were too silent, their gnarled branches twisted like fingers reaching toward us. The more we searched, the heavier the air seemed to become. After an hour of searching, Tommy and Jackal came across something that made our blood run cold. "What is that?" Tommy asked, his voice tense, pointing to the ground. I pushed through the underbrush to get a closer look, my heart sinking. There, on the soft earth, were strange, large footprints that didn't belong to any animal I knew. They were unnaturally deep, and the shape was almost human, but not quite. The toes were elongated, and the edges of the prints were distorted, as if they'd been made by something moving through the earth with unnatural weight. "We need to stick together," I said, my voice shaking as I motioned for everyone to stay close. I didn't want to say it aloud, but the thought gnawed at me. The forest, it was changing us. We were being drawn into something we didn't understand. We moved on, carefully following the strange prints, which seemed to circle back in on themselves, like something was leading us in a twisted game. The forest was shifting with every step we took. Our compasses had all begun to malfunction hours ago, spinning wildly, pointing in every direction but north. Our only guidance now was the fading remnants of Ben's trail and the strange, unsettling feeling that had crept up our spines. We pressed on for another few miles, the trees growing denser, the path narrower. It felt like we were being swallowed whole by the black forest, and I could almost hear the soft whispers of the wind, as if the forest itself were speaking, warning us, beckoning us deeper. And then, just when we thought the landscape couldn't get any more suffocating, we saw something ahead. A small, dark shape nestled between the trees. At first, it was barely visible through the thick mist, but as we approached, the outline of a hut became clear. It was old, weathered. The roof sagged slightly, covered in moss and grime, with walls that looked like they hadn't seen a coat of paint in decades. It sat there, almost hidden by the overgrown brush, like it had been waiting for us. There was no sign of life, no smoke coming from a chimney, no sign of a doorway. But something about it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I motioned for the team to stop. "Stay close." No one split off. We crept toward the hut, careful not to make a sound. As we neared it, the air grew even colder, and the strange, sour scent we'd noticed earlier intensified. It was like the very earth around us had turned rotten. The smell of decay was overwhelming, a heavy musk that clung to the air, suffocating us. The hut was silent, but its presence felt alive, as though it were watching us, waiting for us to make the wrong move. We circled it cautiously. There were no windows, just a single door made of warped wood that was barely hanging on its hinges. The place looked abandoned, but something in my gut told me that we weren't alone here. This wasn't just some forgotten shack. It felt like part of the forest itself, as if it had been built to trap anyone who ventured too close. "I don't like this," Mikey muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "Feels like we're being led here." "We need to check inside," I said, my voice low but firm. We had to know if this hut had any connection to Ben's disappearance. Maybe someone had seen him, maybe it would provide some answers. Sergeant Weber took the lead, her rifle held steady in her hands. She nodded at us to follow as she approached the door, careful and methodical. She didn't knock or announce ourselves. She simply reached for the door and pushed it open. It creaked loudly, breaking the eerie silence that surrounded the hut. We all flinched, expecting something to jump out at us. But when we peered inside, all we saw was darkness, nothing but shadows and the lingering scent of something foul. The inside was small, the walls made of rough-hewn timber, and the air was thick with dust and mildew. Then, as we stepped closer, we noticed something on the floor, a patch of what looked like old, dried blood. It stained the earth around the base of the hut, smeared in odd, jagged streaks. It was fresh, too fresh to be ignored. We couldn't afford to miss any detail now. "Ben could be in there," I said, the words feeling like a weight on my chest. "He has to be." We moved into the hut, careful not to disturb the strange, unsettling atmosphere. The floorboards creaked under our boots as we walked deeper, searching the dark corners of the small space. But there was nothing except the blood and the lingering presence of something evil. The inside of the hut was like stepping into the bowels of something ancient, a place where darkness had festered and twisted for generations. The air inside was thick, stagnant, and oppressive. My breath felt heavy, as though the very walls were pressing in on me. The dim light from our flashlights flickered, casting long, jagged shadows across the wooden walls, making it feel like we were being surrounded by something watching us from the corners. The floor was cluttered with debris, old bones, remnants of past meals, torn clothing, and strange mounds of blackened fabric. I could barely make sense of the twisted assortment of objects strewn about. There were dried herbs hanging from the rafters, some of them still faintly smoking as if the fire that had burned them was long gone, but its effects still lingered. The smell inside was nauseating, something sour, something rotten, and underneath it all, a metallic tang that set my nerves on edge. But what caught my attention, and made my stomach churn, was the large, rusted pot sitting on a stone hearth at the far end of the room. It was positioned with eerie purpose, like it had been left there for us to find. The pot, once shiny and well-kept, was now tarnished, caked with grime and soot. I hesitated for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest, before I slowly moved closer. As the light of my flashlight danced across its surface, my eyes locked onto the dark, foul liquid sloshing inside. The smell hit me like a wall. It was a sickly, putrid odor, mixed with the smell of rot and decay. I gagged but forced myself to lean in closer, dread curling in my stomach. Floating in the viscous liquid were chunks of what looked like human organs, bloated and discolored, suspended in the liquid. There was a heart, a liver, some intestines, pale, twisted remains that should have been buried long ago. It was impossible to make sense of what kind of sickening ritual could have led to this. Whoever had lived here had not just been a hermit or an old woman lost to madness. They were something far worse. "We need to leave now." Sergeant Weber's voice cut through my thoughts, filled with urgency. I nodded in agreement, fighting back the nausea that rose in my throat. This place was beyond our understanding. But before we could retreat, my eyes caught something else. Carved into the walls, scrawled in thick, dark lines, were symbols. Strange, looping shapes and glyphs that seemed to move in the dim light. Some were familiar, runes maybe, but others were alien, unnatural. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end as if the symbols themselves were pressing down on me. "This is some kind of ritualistic space," Jackal whispered, his voice trembling. "We should have never come here. We should have turned back." "I agree," Mikey added, his voice unsteady. There's nothing for us here. Nothing but death. Just as I was about to suggest we gather our things and leave, we heard it. A noise, a low, guttural growl that rumbled through the hut and vibrated in the bones of my chest. It wasn't an animal sound. It was something worse. Get ready, Weber hissed, pulling her rifle from its sling. We all shifted, our bodies instinctively falling into defensive positions, eyes darting toward the door. I could feel my pulse quicken as I scanned the surroundings, trying to spot the source of the growl. Then we heard the crashing sounds from outside, leaves and branches snapping under heavy footsteps. Something large was moving toward us. Suddenly, a large boar emerged from the trees just outside the hut, its eyes wild and bloodshot, its tusks gleaming in the dim light of the evening. It was charging straight for us, its jaws snapping hungrily. We reacted instinctively. Gunshots rang out in the tense silence, the sound of our rifles deafening. Each shot missed, narrowly missing the charging beast, but it didn't stop. It was getting closer, faster, the ground trembling under its weight. Its eyes gleamed with an unnatural ferocity, and the way it moved felt almost wrong. The atmosphere around us thickened, as if the very forest was closing in on us. The sound of the boar's growls mixed with a distant, ominous noise, cawing. The sky above us had darkened, the twilight turning into an oppressive blackness as hundreds of ravens appeared, swooping and swirling in the sky above the hut. Their calls echoed in the distance, sharp, jarring, a chorus of screams that made my skin crawl. It was as though the birds were orchestrating the chaos, their wings slicing through the air like an unnatural storm. "Shoot it!" Weber shouted, her voice desperate, but the shots didn't seem to stop the beast. Each time we fired, it seemed to lurch forward, unhindered. The ravens above us had become something more than just a nuisance. They circled in tight, organized patterns, their wings cutting through the air with an eerie, rhythmic precision. It was as though they were orchestrating the chaos, their cause now more like a chant, an unholy symphony that disrupted not just our hearing, but our very perception of the world around us. Each beat of their wings seemed to muddle our senses. My vision began to blur, the edges of my sight pulling into a smudged haze, and I could feel my mind struggling to focus. Every sound was distorted, every footstep in the forest around us warped into something alien, something distant. I tried to shake off the sensation, but it only grew worse. It felt like the birds were drawing us in, pulling us towards something we couldn't see. The world seemed to shift underfoot, as if the ground was tilting, stretching in unnatural ways. The weight of the forest pressing down on me was unbearable. My breath quickened, and my heart started to race again, as if the very air had become thicker, harder to move through. The compass in my hand began to flicker. The needle wavered, shifting wildly, unable to find its direction. I glanced at Weber, who was holding her own compass. It was doing the same thing. It wasn't just our compasses either. One by one, we pulled out our navigational tools, all of them betraying us. The needle spun crazily, lost in the chaos of the forest. "Damn it," I muttered under my breath, my grip tightening on the useless device. "We're not just lost, something's messing with our heads. With the compass. Something is messing with us," Jackal added, his voice tight with fear. "We need to figure out what the hell is going on." "We'll get through this," I said, my voice trying to sound stronger than I felt. "Just keep your heads clear. Focus. We're sticking together. No one goes off alone." With the compass malfunctioning, we had no choice but to rely on our instincts, and that was a terrifying prospect. We were no longer navigating through the familiar. The Black Forest had transformed into something foreign, a living nightmare where time and space didn't seem to follow the same rules. I motioned for the group to split into two teams. Weber and I would lead one group, and Jackal would take the other. We had to move quickly. Ben was out there, lost, and who knows what else had happened in the night. We needed to find him, and we needed to get out. "We'll take the left side of the ridge," I said, pointing through the thick, dark trees. "We'll keep moving in a straight line. Jackal, take your team around the right side. Stay in contact, and if you find anything, we regroup immediately." Jackal nodded, his face pale, but there was no time to waste. The rest of the team shifted into position, each of us feeling the weight of the forest grow heavier, pressing down on us like a living thing. The ravens continued their aerial patrol above us, casting their shadows over the forest floor. The sound of their wings, once a distant annoyance, now felt like a presence, like the very air was being consumed by their dark flight. Their calls were no longer just disturbing, they were infecting the silence, seeping into our minds like a poison. Every time I looked up, I thought I saw something in the sky, some shift in the patterns of their flight, but when I tried to focus, nothing was there. As we marched forward, the forest seemed to stretch on endlessly. The trees around us grew denser, their branches twisted and contorted into unnatural shapes. The ground beneath our boots felt soft and spongy, as if it were constantly shifting. The air itself felt charged, as if a storm was just waiting to break, yet it was utterly still. It was the kind of stillness that gnawed at the edges of your mind, making you feel like you were being watched. I kept my voice low, trying to keep the team focused. Eyes open. Stay close. We'll find Ben. We'll get out. But the tension was palpable. Every snap of a twig, every rustling leaf sent our heads snapping in that direction. The slightest sound now seemed amplified, as though the forest itself had grown louder, more intrusive. The ravens above us cawed, their sharp voices a constant reminder that something was out of place. We kept moving, forcing ourselves to push forward despite the overwhelming unease. I could see the fear starting to settle into the faces of my team. It was in their eyes, the way they looked around, the way their steps faltered for just a second too long. There was a real terror taking root, and I knew that if we let it take hold, it would be the end of us. I could feel the dread creeping into my own heart, but I couldn't let it show. I had to stay in control. If I faltered, the whole team would. Keep it together, I whispered under my breath, even though I was starting to question my own grip on reality. We moved in tense silence, each of us hyper-aware of the forest around us. The air was thick with the feeling that something was about to break, that we were on the edge of something far worse than we could understand. And the ravens continued to circle above, their calls echoing like a warning, a harbinger of what lay ahead. Suddenly we stopped. A faint sound reached our ears, a low, growling hum that echoed through the trees. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was something deeper, more primal. I motioned for the team to stay still, holding up my hand. "Do you hear that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of my pounding heart. Everyone went silent, straining to listen. The noise was getting louder, coming from the left. It was like a growl, low, guttural, almost like a hum from deep within the earth. And then, before we could react, it exploded into the rustling sound of something heavy moving through the brush, coming fast. I didn't have to look to know what it was. "A boar!" someone hissed, but it was already too late. The beast emerged from the trees, its massive form charging directly at us, its tusks gleaming in the dim light. We raised our rifles, but the thing was moving too fast, its body a blur. "Fire!" Weber barked, and the sound of our rifles cracking into the air was deafening. But the boar didn't stop. It kept coming. I fired a shot, and for a moment, the boar stumbled. But it wasn't enough to stop it. The thing was huge, bigger than any boar I'd ever seen before. And its eyes, those eyes weren't just wild with hunger. They were malignant, something unnatural behind them. And then, as quickly as it had charged, the beast vanished into the trees. One moment, it was there, its jaws snapping inches from my face, and the next, it was gone, like it had been swallowed by the forest itself. The ravens overhead screamed again, their cries cutting through the air, and I felt my blood run cold. The panic that had been simmering in my team finally erupted. "What the hell was that?" Mikey screamed, his voice full of terror. "Stay together," I shouted, my voice hoarse from the adrenaline. "We're not done here. We'll find Ben. We'll find whoever else is out here. Stay together." But the ravens kept calling, and the tension in the air was thick enough to choke us. The forest seemed to close in tighter around us, its shadows deepening, its silence suffocating. Every step forward felt like we were marching deeper into a nightmare that had no end. And I couldn't help but feel that whatever was out there, whatever was causing this, it was watching us, waiting for us to break. We couldn't let that happen. Not now. Not yet. At 3:30 a.m., the forest seemed to grow heavier. We had been moving for hours, and I was beginning to lose all sense of time. The ravens were still circling above us, their cries punctuating the silence in a way that set my nerves on edge. We were supposed to be searching for Ben, but the deeper we ventured, the more we seemed to fall into a labyrinth of confusion. I kept checking my watch, but time no longer seemed to make sense. The cold was seeping into my bones, and with the growing fear among the team, I could feel something primal stirring within me. I had been pushing my men and women, keeping everyone moving, but the tension was becoming unbearable. That's when we heard the first shot. It cracked through the air like a sudden burst of thunder, loud enough to make us jump, even in the stillness of the night. It wasn't a single shot. It was a series of them, rapid and erratic, echoing across the trees. We froze. "That's coming from Jackal's team," Weber said, her voice sharp with concern. "I know," I said, trying to steady my breathing. "They're probably just signaling for us to regroup. Let's move." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The sound of gunfire was too close, too chaotic, and there was a sharpness to it that didn't feel right. It wasn't the kind of shot we'd take in training. There was no order, no precision to it. It sounded like panic. We rushed toward the noise. The forest seemed to close in on us, shadows stretching like claws, and the air grew colder, thicker with every step. We had to keep moving. No one spoke. The only sound now was the crunch of our boots on the damp leaves. By 4 a.m., we reached a small clearing. There, hanging from the thick branch of a twisted oak tree, was Ben. His body was limp, swaying in the cold wind, eyes wide open in shock. He was stripped of his clothes, just like the others. His face was pale, his mouth slightly agape as if he had been screaming before whatever had killed him had finished with him. I couldn't breathe. For a moment, everything stopped. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. Ben, my friend, my teammate, hanging from a tree like an offering, his body contorted unnaturally in death. "Ben," I muttered, my voice hoarse. Weber moved in closer, trying to steady herself, but I saw her hand tremble. She reached out, checking his pulse, though we both knew there was nothing to check. "It's him," she said softly. "But how? Who did this?" There were no words to answer her. We all stood there, frozen, the reality sinking in. A sudden noise broke the silence. Jackal's team emerged from the shadows, their faces grim. Their movements were slow, deliberate, as if they were carrying a weight much heavier than their gear. "Sir, we were attacked," Jackal said. His voice was tight, strained. "A group of people. They came at us, fast and brutal. They were armed, shouting something in a language we couldn't understand. We had no choice but to shoot into the air. We thought they were going to kill us." "What kind of people?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "They weren't normal," Jackal replied, shaking his head. "They were dressed like peasants, but there was something off about them. Their eyes, they were wild. And they had this look, like they weren't scared of anything." "We had to fire," Weber interjected. "They wouldn't stop. We had no other choice." I ran a hand through my hair, trying to piece things together. First Ben, now this attack. Whatever was happening in these woods, it was far worse than we had expected. The forest wasn't just haunted by the supernatural. It was alive with something else, something malicious and human. "I don't get it," I said, trying to think through the chaos. "These people attacked us and now Ben." "That's not all," Jackal added, looking over his shoulder. "When we tried to retreat, we saw something. A figure standing at the edge of the trees. It was a woman, wearing nothing but rags. Her hair was wild, like a tangled mess of thorns, and her eyes were glowing. I've never seen anything like it." I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The story was starting to come together. The old man's warnings, the strange signs we had found earlier, and now the attack. It was all pointing to something terrible. But we had no idea what it was. "Where's the rest of the team?" I asked, my mind racing. "They're back at the camp," Jackal said. "But we need to get out of here. This place, it's cursed, I can feel it. Whatever we're dealing with here, it's not human." I turned to look at Ben again, my gut twisting. The body hanging from the tree was a warning, I realized. Whoever, or whatever, was in these woods, it was sending a message. And it was one we didn't want to hear. I glanced at my watch. The time was 4:15 a.m., and the forest seemed to grow darker with every passing minute. We had to make a choice. We could turn back now, get the hell out of here and report back to base. But something told me that leaving wasn't an option. The people who were supposed to be rescued were still out there, lost, probably already dead, and we had no idea what had really happened to them. "All right, we're not leaving until we find out the truth," I said, trying to steady my voice. We go back to the camp, we gather our gear, and we search the woods for the rest of the team. We'll find Ben's killers and we'll get answers." The others nodded, but there was no enthusiasm in their faces. The fear was starting to set in, thick and suffocating. As we began to head back, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking straight into the heart of something far more dangerous than we'd ever prepared for. We couldn't leave now. But the question that gnawed at me as we walked through the dark, the sound of the ravens still filling the air, what were we really fighting against? The night was far from over, and the forest had only just begun to show its true face. By 5 a.m., we found the hostages, or what was left of them. The camp was in disarray. There were signs of a brutal struggle, scattered gear, bloodied patches of grass, and shredded tents. It looked like they had been ambushed in the middle of their own camp, with no warning. But it wasn't just the chaos that struck me. It was the girl. She couldn't have been older than 16. She stood there, in the middle of the camp, a blood-soaked knife still clenched in her hand. Her eyes were wide, almost inhumanly so, as she stared at us, unblinking. Her hair was wild, unkempt, and her clothes, what little there was of them, were tattered and stained with blood. "Stay back," I warned my team, raising my weapon. The sight of the girl had stunned everyone into a brief silence. But the silence was shattered by the sound of movement behind us. We spun around, weapons raised, but it was already too late. She lunged. The attack was swift. Too swift. I barely saw her coming before she was on top of Sergeant Daniels. Her hands were like claws, slashing at his throat. She was so fast. We opened fire, but the girl was already gone, disappearing into the shadows with a speed that seemed impossible. Did you see that?" Weber gasped, her face pale. "I saw it," I said, my voice shaking. "We need to move. Now." As we moved quickly through the camp, searching for any sign of our missing team, I couldn't shake the image of that girl. Her face, so young, but twisted with something far older. I felt a chill spread through me, colder than the forest itself. She wasn't just human. Not anymore. Then, as we searched the perimeter, we found them. The clothes. Shredded pieces of fabric scattered across the ground. Clothing that belonged to the tourists we had come to rescue. There were IDs too, bits of identification that matched the names we had been given. It was them. The family. They were still alive. At least they had been. But something had happened to them. Their clothes were torn, some of them splattered with what looked like blood. The wallets and ID cards were soaked in dirt and grime, but I could make out the names of the people we were supposed to save: Benjamin Carter, Emily Carter, David Montgomery, and Margaret Montgomery. Powerful names, people with connections that reached deep into the political circles back in the States. This wasn't just about rescuing innocent tourists anymore. It was a matter of national security. We couldn't fail them. "This is bad," Weber said, looking at the remains of the IDs, her voice shaky. "I don't think they're still alive, sir. I think they're gone." I turned to face her, feeling my gut tighten with dread. "We're going to find them, Weber. We'll bring them home." But as I said it, I felt the weight of those words settle like lead in my chest. I didn't know if I believed them anymore. At 6 a.m., the sun was starting to rise, but it didn't feel like any normal morning. The sky was a dull gray, and the forest had an unnatural stillness to it. The air was thick with the scent of death, and every rustling sound in the woods made us flinch. We continued to search the camp, trying to make sense of what had happened. Weber crouched down next to a pile of debris and began sifting through it. Her fingers brushed against something metallic, and she froze. "Look," she said, holding up a small, bloodied badge. It was one of ours, a team member's ID. This was Danielle's. My stomach dropped. If Daniels was dead, then that meant we were no longer just up against the supernatural, we were in a fight for survival against something far more deadly. As the team reassembled, we found more signs of struggle, footprints leading away from the camp. They weren't human. They were much larger, more erratic, as though someone, or something, had dragged our missing team members away. I took a deep breath. There was no turning back now. We had to go after them, even if it meant facing the horrors that lay ahead in the depths of the Black Forest. "Move out," I ordered, my voice firm despite the fear creeping into my veins. "We're going after them. We don't leave anyone behind." It was then that I realized, The forest wasn't just alive with strange creatures. It was alive with an ancient evil, and we were walking straight into its heart. Time was running out, and we had no idea what was waiting for us in the darkness. We would find the tourists, we would bring them home, or die trying. Our rations, which had already been questionable the night before, were now completely inedible. I watched in disgust as I tried to pry open a can of beans, only for it to spew a rancid, yellowish liquid that smelled like something died inside it days ago. The bread had turned to mush, and the jerky, well, it wasn't jerky anymore. It was as if everything had rotted in an instant. God damn it, what's going on? Matthews cursed under his breath as he tossed the can aside. He wiped his hand on his shirt, disgust etched on his face. None of this should be like this. Everything was fine when we packed it. We were low on supplies, and the lingering stench of rotting food only added to the growing unease that gripped the remaining members of our squad. There were only 5 of us now, myself, Rhodes, Weber, Matthews, and Sergeant Daniels. The others had either disappeared or met a gruesome end. It wasn't just the food. There was something wrong with the very air. The faint, foul scent of decay hung in the forest around us like a pall, as if the trees themselves had become tainted. The deeper we went, the heavier the air grew, the harder it became to breathe. Weber stood off to the side, her eyes wide, darting from shadow to shadow. Her movements were jerky, almost erratic, as if she were trying to suppress something within herself. There was a strange, unsettling quality to her presence now, something beyond just exhaustion. It was as if the woods were changing her, twisting her. Her voice, when she spoke, sounded wrong, off, like she wasn't fully aware of what was happening around her. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice low, hoarse from lack of sleep. "Now." But even as I spoke those words, I wasn't sure how we would find our way out. The compass was still useless, spinning aimlessly in all directions, and our map had become nothing more than a tattered piece of paper with no meaning. We had no clear path, no direction to go. We were lost. Sergeant Daniels, ever the practical one, suggested we split up into 2 teams and search the surrounding area. His voice was steady, but I could see the fear behind his eyes. It was the same fear we all shared now, the feeling that something was out there, watching us, waiting for us to make a mistake. "We'll split into 2 teams, Daniels ordered. "Rhodes, you and Matthews take the east. Weber, you're with me. We'll search west. Keep your heads on a swivel. This place is alive, and it's not friendly." We did as we were told, but the atmosphere was so oppressive that it felt like the forest was closing in on us, trapping us in its clutches. The light from our flashlights barely cut through the thick fog that had settled over the ground. The shadows stretched long, like dark fingers reaching for us, and the trees swayed unnaturally, even though there was no wind. As night fell again, the air grew colder. I didn't want to sleep, but I knew we had to rest if we were going to make it out. We gathered around the fire, huddling together for warmth. The sound of distant ravens echoed through the trees, their cries sending shivers down my spine. By 2 a.m., we'd taken our shifts, trying to catch some sleep while others kept watch. But it wasn't sleep we were getting. It was a restless, uneasy sort of stupor. My mind kept wandering back to the images of what we had found. The bloodied remains of our fallen comrades, the odd symbols, the strange woman who seemed to follow us. It was too much to comprehend. At some point, my exhaustion won out, and I finally closed my eyes, hoping that when I woke up, we would be out of this nightmare. But when I awoke, everything was wrong. 3. The fire had burned low, casting eerie shadows that danced across the trees. The air was heavier, more oppressive. I looked around and saw something that sent a chill down my spine. Weber, Chiti, was standing by the campfire, her back to me. But it wasn't just her posture that was off. Her figure was hunched, and her arms were moving frantically, digging through something. I squinted in the darkness, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. And then I froze. She was eating Sergeant Daniels. The remains of his body lay sprawled out next to the fire, blood staining the earth beneath him, his entrails torn out and scattered like some macabre feast. Weber's mouth was covered in gore as she hungrily consumed his insides. Her eyes glowed faintly in the dark, her face contorted in an expression of pure, ravenous hunger. I could hardly breathe. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My body wouldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to comprehend what I was witnessing. Then she stopped. Her head snapped up, her eyes locking onto mine. For a moment, there was a strange calm in her gaze, as if she recognized me, or was pretending to. And then she shifted. Her body seemed to convulse, her figure warping and changing in a sickening way. I saw her face, but it wasn't the face of Weber anymore. It was the same face I had seen before, the girl from the forest. The one who had lured Ben away. The one who had haunted our every step since. I stumbled back, my heart racing in my chest, but before I could make a sound, she vanished into the mist, as though she had never been there at all. I tried to shake off the vision, but my hands trembled uncontrollably. I couldn't stop thinking about what I had just seen. It wasn't Weber anymore. Whatever had happened to her, it wasn't natural. I looked around the camp, and the others were beginning to stir. Matthews and Rhodes, both bleary-eyed, groggily waking up from their slumber, looked confused and disoriented. "Where's Daniels?" Matthews asked, his voice low, groggy. "Weber, she killed him," I whispered, my voice trembling. "She ate him. She's not Weber anymore." They stared at me, disbelief and confusion written on their faces. But the horror of what I had just witnessed was too real. There was no denying it. Weber was gone, and in her place was something else. Something far worse. The wind picked up, howling through the trees like a warning. The ravens continued to circle above us, their harsh cries splitting the stillness of the night. And in that moment, the sound of Weber's voice echoed in my ears, faint but unmistakable. "You shouldn't have come here," she whispered, her voice low and cold, almost a laugh. As the others began to pray, whispering desperate pleas to God for mercy, I knew there was no escaping the curse of the Schwarzwald Hexen. The forest had become a suffocating presence, pressing down on us with each step. The stench of rot and decay was thick in the air, clinging to our clothes and skin like a second layer. We all smelled foul, our bodies drenched in sweat and dirt. But it was worse than that. The stench that clung to us wasn't just the smell of sweat and dirt, it was something deeper. It was the smell of death itself. I had tried to ignore the pain in my leg for hours, the cut that had started as a small gash but was now turning an unnatural, sickly color. The skin around the wound was blotched with dark purple and green, and a foul odor seemed to rise from it, like something was rotting beneath my flesh. Every time I took a step, it felt like the cut was burning, the infection spreading deeper with each movement. I had tried to clean it as best as I could, but the lack of proper medical supplies was only making it worse. It was as if the forest itself was feeding off of us, draining our strength, and making sure none of us would make it out alive. The pain was unbearable now, sharp and constant, but I couldn't show it. Not in front of the others. They were already on edge, their eyes darting nervously around the trees, and I didn't want to add to their growing panic. But the feeling of decay, of something festering just beneath the surface, was too much to ignore. It felt like the forest was consuming us from the inside out. I caught a glimpse of my reflection in a nearby puddle as we walked, and the sight of my pale, sweat-soaked face sent a chill down my spine. My skin looked sickly, too thin, as if I hadn't eaten in days. My eyes were sunken, the bloodshot whites surrounded by dark circles. I didn't recognize myself. Rhodes was still stumbling beside me, his breath shallow, his face ashen. He had been slowing down, his body weakening with each step, and I could tell his fever was only getting worse. We all had it now, the sickness that had been creeping through our bodies like an invisible poison. The forest was doing this to us, twisting our bodies, our minds. We didn't speak much as we continued walking. The words didn't seem to matter anymore. We were all too focused on putting one foot in front of the other, desperate to escape the curse that had already claimed so many. Matthews was ahead, muttering under his breath, his eyes flicking nervously between the trees. I could see him trembling, his hands shaking as he gripped his rifle, ready to fire at any moment. The tension in the air was thick, like something was just waiting to snap. Then, suddenly, there was a sound, an eerie rustling in the trees, a low growl, almost like an animal stalking us from the shadows. My heart raced, and my grip tightened on my rifle. But when I turned around, I saw nothing. "Did you hear that?" Matthews asked, his voice shaky. I nodded, but I wasn't sure if I had really heard it or if it was just the fever playing tricks on me. The sound seemed to have come from everywhere and nowhere, and I could feel it in the pit of my stomach. Something was out there, watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. We pushed forward, each step feeling like we were walking through a nightmare. The trees closed in around us, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms. I could feel the weight of the forest pressing down on us, the shadows growing longer and deeper with each passing minute. And then I heard it again, the growl, closer this time. I turned around, but still, there was nothing there. But I knew we weren't alone. The old couple's warning echoed in my mind, "You don't want to meet the witch." And just when I thought it couldn't get worse, I felt something wet against my leg. I looked down and my heart sank. The wound on my leg had opened further, blood seeping through my pants, but it wasn't just blood. There was something black and foul-looking mixed with it, as if the infection had spread deeper. The skin around the cut had become loose and soft, and I could feel it starting to rot. I gritted my teeth and tried to ignore it. There was no time to deal with this now. But my senses were overwhelmed. The smell, the rot, everything felt like it was closing in on me. My mouth went dry, and I felt a wave of nausea hit me. "Keep moving," I forced out, trying to steady my breath. "We can't stop. We have to get out of here." The others nodded, though their faces were pale, their eyes wild with fear. As we kept moving, I could feel the sickness spreading through my body. The fever was burning me from the inside out, but it was the decay that had me truly terrified. It was like the forest was alive, breathing with us, feeding off our weakness. Our bodies were beginning to rot from the inside, just like the trees, the ground beneath our feet. I could feel the poison of the hexen working its way through our veins, inching closer to our souls. And then, as if to confirm our worst fears, the sounds of the forest grew louder. There was a soft, whispering hum, as if the trees themselves were speaking to each other, plotting something dark, something terrible. But the worst part? I could feel it. Something was watching us. We were already too far gone. As the old couple had warned us, we were no longer just facing a kidnapping. We were fighting something far more sinister. But we hadn't believed them. No, we had laughed at their warnings, brushing them off as nothing more than tales told by frightened villagers. The warnings had been clear. The hexen. I could still hear the old man's words ringing in my ears. "Leave the forest. The hexen will devour you. They feed on fear, and they will never let you go once they have you." His voice had been laced with dread, and his eyes, full of terror, had pierced into me, as if he knew exactly what awaited us. Yet, at that moment, we were too proud to listen. We were soldiers. We carried M16 rifles, hand grenades, and enough artillery to wipe out entire battalions. What could some old German folk tales do to us? We had been trained for combat in the harshest conditions. The Cold War was in full swing, and we had been sent to rescue a group of high-profile tourists with powerful political connections. We had a mission, a goal. Nothing more mattered. We had assumed that the tourist's disappearance was simply a matter of being abducted by rogue Soviets using the Black Forest as a hideout. The threat of communism hung over Europe, and we had convinced ourselves that the kidnappers were merely after leverage to make demands. We couldn't fathom that something far more dangerous, far older, was lurking within those ancient woods. In retrospect, I realized we had fallen into the trap of arrogance. The forest had consumed us, both in body and mind. We were no longer soldiers, but husks of men, hollowed out by fear and exhaustion. The night had lasted for what felt like an eternity, the darkness pressing in on us from all sides. Every tree, every rustling leaf seemed to whisper curses in the wind. The ground, once solid beneath our boots, now felt treacherous and soft, as if it were trying to swallow us whole. We had become lost. Completely lost. The compass was useless. The map seemed to mock us with its faded lines and unreadable markings. Our feet were sore, our throats dry, and the foul stench of decay had settled in our clothes, on our skin, in our lungs. The forest had a life of its own now, its very air charged with a strange, unsettling energy. We no longer knew what was real. The line between the supernatural and the tangible had blurred beyond recognition. We had lost men. We had lost our way. And we had lost hope. The spirits of the forest, the hexen, had all but broken us. I could see the madness creeping into the eyes of my fellow soldiers. The voices, the hallucinations, the constant feeling of being watched, they were no longer distant possibilities. They were right there with us in the shadows. The thing that haunted us most was not just the forest, but the crushing sense of inevitability. That somehow we had already lost. There was no escape. But just when I thought our mission, and our lives, had reached their end, a flicker of light appeared. We had been stumbling through the forest for hours, too weak to continue, when we saw them. The old couple. They appeared as if out of nowhere, stepping quietly from the trees as if they had always been there, waiting. The woman, bent and frail, held out a canteen of water to me. Her husband, with a deeply lined face that seemed carved by time itself, nodded solemnly at me. They were the same couple who had warned us days earlier, the ones who spoke of the Hexen. I had thought them mad, superstitious old fools, but now, standing before them, I wondered if they had been our salvation all along. The woman's voice was soft but steady, and the words she spoke held a strange power. "You have not been abandoned," she said, her gaze locking onto mine. "You are lost, but you have not been forsaken. Come with us." We drank the water she gave us. It was cool, refreshing, a stark contrast to the dry, acrid air that had been choking us for days. As we drank, the fog of fear and madness that had clouded my mind began to lift, if only slightly. It was as if the water itself held some kind of healing power, soothing the wounds we had sustained, both physical and mental. The old couple led us through the dense woods, their movements slow but purposeful. We followed, unsure of what else to do, but grateful for their presence. As we walked, the darkness seemed to recede. The trees that had once appeared twisted and threatening now seemed less menacing. The oppressive weight of the forest lifted, replaced by an eerie stillness that felt peaceful. I couldn't help but wonder if these two were more than just elderly villagers. Could they be something else? Something otherworldly? The thought lingered in the back of my mind, but it didn't matter. All that mattered was that we were alive, and for the first time in days, we had a glimmer of hope. The journey out of the forest was slow, but we made progress. The Hexen, whatever they were, did not pursue us. The strange whispers we had heard before were silenced. The ravens that had circled above us were gone, their haunting cause now distant memories. The forest, once alive with its own malevolent presence, seemed to release its grip on us, allowing us to pass. Finally, we emerged from the woods. It was daylight, and the soft morning sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows on the forest floor. We had made it. We turned to thank the old couple, but they were gone. There was no sign of them anywhere, no trace of their footprints, no indication of where they had gone. It was as if they had never been there at all. But we didn't need to ask any questions. We didn't need to understand. What mattered was that we were free. Our mission, though unfinished, had ended. The tourists we were meant to rescue had likely been lost to the Hexen, their fates sealed long before we arrived. But we had survived, and that, in itself, was a victory. I looked at the faces of the men who had made it out with me. Sergeant Mitchell, Corporal Harris, Private Thompson, and myself. We were all broken, but we were together. We had endured something most men could never even imagine. And despite everything that had happened, we had not lost our faith. We stood there, in the light of a new day, our hearts heavy but our spirits unbroken. For the first time in days, I could breathe without feeling as though something was lurking just beyond my sight. We were alive. As we finally stepped into the light, the weight of what had happened began to hit me. The mission was over, but the scars would last forever. Our team, once a well-oiled machine, had been shattered, each man broken by the horrors we had witnessed in the Schwarzwald. The dead were not just our comrades, they were friends, brothers in arms, each with their own story, their own life cut short by the curse of the forest. We walked for hours, silently, the cool morning air biting into our skin, the full weight of our loss sinking in. And with every step, we felt the absence of those we had left behind. They weren't just soldiers we had lost. They were human beings who had lived, loved, and had dreams. Now, those dreams would never be realized. Our comrades, Ben, Sergeant Mitchell, Corporal Harris, and the others were gone. We couldn't bring them back. We couldn't undo the horrors we had witnessed, the gory remains of our team members. But in our hearts, we knew we had to do something. We had to honor them. We had to let them rest. We found a quiet spot near the edge of the forest where the sunlight filtered through the trees like a warm embrace. It was the best we could do, no grand ceremony, no formal burial, just a few stones piled together to mark where they had fallen. Ben's body had been found hanging from a tree, his eyes wide with terror, his face frozen in an expression of unimaginable horror. We had no choice but to leave him behind, but we marked the spot as best we could, placing rocks in a solemn circle around the base of the tree where he had been found. Corporal Harris, who had died in the chaos of the Boer attack, was buried in a shallow grave. The soil was soft beneath our fingers, and we covered him with whatever we could find, branches, leaves, stones, as if to give him a little dignity in death. He had been so full of life when we first set out on this mission, and now he was nothing more than a nameless body buried under the weight of the forest. Sergeant Mitchell's death had been perhaps the most brutal. We had heard the screams, those gut-wrenching, desperate cries in the middle of the night as the forest closed in around us. The Hexen had taken him, his body mangled beyond recognition, left in the hollow of a tree like some grotesque offering. But even so, we couldn't just leave him there. We marked his spot with a collection of stones, forming a rough cairn. It wasn't much, but it was all we could do, all we could offer. As we stood there, our heads hung low in silent mourning, I felt a heavy weight in my chest. We were the last ones standing, the only ones who had made it out of that cursed forest alive. The mission had failed. We had failed to rescue the tourists, and we had lost so much. But at least we had each other, and that was something. We held a brief, quiet prayer, each of us speaking to God in our own way, asking for forgiveness, for strength, and for peace for our fallen comrades. The wind stirred in the trees, and for a moment, it felt as though the forest itself was listening. As the final rock was placed on top of the makeshift grave of Sergeant Mitchell, I felt the weight of it all, the grief, the guilt, the horror, lift just slightly. We were no longer in the forest, but the forest would never truly leave us. The Hexen, the horrors, the memories of what had happened, would haunt us forever. But for now, we had made it out. And for now, that was enough. As we began our long trek back to the military base, the silence between us was heavy but comforting. The mission was over. The forest was behind us. But the loss of our brothers would never be forgotten. They were with us, in our thoughts, in our prayers, in our hearts. We had survived. And though our bodies were battered and bruised, our spirits, though shattered, remained intact. And so we walked, together, though forever changed. If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. 90% of our amazing listeners aren't subscribed yet, and your support means the world to me. Every like and subscription is a huge encouragement and motivates me to keep bringing you even more captivating stories in the future. Stay tuned, and thank you for being part of this journey.